As you may know, President Wilson was the first and really only president to have earned a PhD. That in his era, he was quite a prominent political scientist before going on to be president of Princeton and then governor of New Jersey and, of course, a two-term president. So in creating this living memorial, they gave the Wilson Center the assignment of bringing together both sides of his life. That side that was focused on doing research on public policy and government and how the world worked or should work, together bringing that together with the political side, the policy-making side. And so what we try to do is to bring together some of the best thinkers around the country, really, and around the world, together with people like yourselves who are making policy or influencing policy or really engaged in the policy work here in Washington or elsewhere around the country. And in fact, we do often presentations around the world. And we try to achieve this goal in two ways. We do research here. Over the course of a year, there will be perhaps 150 people that come to do research here. Some are full-time academics who come for an academic year. Sometimes it's people from the press who have an insightful idea they want to put down on paper. Sometimes we'll have former people from an administration or people who have left the Hill and want to sit and think about what their life on the Hill really has been like. And of course, the staff here as well does its own scholarly work, kind of in-house scholars that produce their own research. And then we bring people like yourselves, as I said, together with some of these really best thinkers, where we'll have conferences and seminars and really effective gatherings where we pride ourselves on getting really the right people like yourselves in the room. Well, this is a perfect segue for me to introduce our main speaker. Craig Giffi is the Vice Chairman and U.S. Consumer and Industrial Products Practice Leader at Deloitte. He has a very distinguished background and has become really, I would say, a passionate analyst, if I can put those two together, of the whole manufacturing area. And the consumer industrial products practice encompasses an enormous array of industries. It really ranges from aerospace all the way to retail. He works here in town as well with the Council on Competitiveness and their extensive work on manufacturing. He is, in fact, they have a multi-year focus on manufacturing there. He has talked to all the key groups in the world. He's talked with the World Economic Forum. As you know, that's a major gathering in Davos, Switzerland. He is the co-author of Competing in World-Class Manufacturing, America's 21st Century Challenge. And I must say, here at the Wilson Center, we take that challenge seriously and hope to do quite a series on manufacturing and its role in the innovation system, as well as in its role in undergirding our whole industrial base. I'm also delighted to introduce Nayani Gupta. She's at IDA with what they call STIPI, the Science Technology Policy Institute. And that really is a research and analytic arm for the Office of Science and Technology Policy in the White House. Before being lured into the public policy arena, she worked with Intel, where she was an engineer, generated 2 patents. She developed predictive simulation models for core microprocessor technology development. I can barely understand the sentence, let alone what she must have done to achieve that. She has a very distinguished academic background, as does Craig. They really are two very accomplished people. Well, Craig, let me turn the floor over to you, and then we'll turn to Nayani for some comments.
Great, thank you. Well, thank you very much. I hope that you can see the slides, because I have a zillion slides to go through. So today will not be this morning we'll keep you attentive, if nothing else. And we will absolutely share them with you later. Absolutely. In fact, I sent Kent a copy, and he can make sure that it gets out to everybody that's interested. So let me kind of take you through, and what I want to do, here's what I'm going to try to cover in the next 45 minutes or so at a breakneck pace. We talked about this being the manufacturing competitiveness imperative for the United States, and I want to talk a little bit about our research background, kind of how did I get here, what have I done over the years, and that led to this particular day to this point. What defines a country's competitiveness, what our research has found. What countries are the most competitive? What does the data say? What's the input in terms of, from a manufacturing competitiveness standpoint, who's the most competitive? Then I'm going to talk a little bit about what the trends are that are shaping competitiveness in the future for manufacturing organizations. And then finally, if I go fast enough, we're going to talk about how the best companies in the world are competing, the best manufacturing companies, and what the data tells us about that. So from a research standpoint, I actually started this over 20-some years ago as a partner in a large audit tax consulting firm. I'm not an auditor or a tax person, so I'm a consultant. We continue to try to do research alongside of our client work to make sure that we're looking at the right issues and we understand the topics in sufficient detail so we can provide both the right advice and the right counsel to clients. And I really started doing some global research back in the late 1980s, and that continued through the middle of the 1990s. The book that Kent is talking about goes back to 1989, 1990, which was something called Competing in World-Class Manufacturing, America's 21st Century Challenge. We had no idea how prophetic that would be back in 1989 when we finished it up, but it certainly has become America's 21st Century Challenge. And so much of what we put in that book over 20 years ago is in fact right on target, certainly from a management principles standpoint and a focus area, but a number of other things have changed. Started to expand that research more globally back in 1991, 92. You see a little Japanese flag there and a U.S. flag. The real focus back then was competing with Japan. And in this country, we were very concerned about the Japanese and Japanese manufacturing competitiveness and how we were going to keep pace with that and what that meant for us. It's a different Asian country that we're very concerned about today, but very similar sets of issues facing us. More recently, so let me focus on more recently, we've done some work, as Kent mentioned, with the Council on Competitiveness. On the left-hand side there, you see a 2010 in the background, a Global Competitiveness Index. We're actually preparing, we have input now for our 2013 Global Manufacturing Competitiveness Index. We started this index because we were dissatisfied with the efforts of the World Economic Forum and others that looked at competitiveness and told us that Switzerland was the most competitive country in the world. So as manufacturers, we thought, well, we understood, what went into that, but in reality, we didn't see that as a major threat. When I worked with my clients, when I worked with other subject matter experts, manufacturing was playing out in a very large way in different countries around the world, and therefore there were different drivers, not completely aligned with what the World Economic Forum would look at in their index. We've also, as a result of working with the council, we've had a chance to go out and interview face-to-face different constituent groups in their business model. And their model includes CEOs, as Kent knows, because Kent was the leader of the Council on Competitiveness and understands their formula very well, but includes CEOs, business leaders, it includes university presidents, and it includes labor leaders. Shortly after we did the index in 2010, so in 2010, 2011, 12, actually 11, we started doing these face-to-face interviews, and the first group was with CEOs around the country. Second group was the university presidents, that's Ignite 2.0, and the third group was labor leaders, and we were looking for their personal input. Their recommendations to policymakers as to what would be necessary to bolster America's manufacturing competitiveness on the heels of what we were finding in our index work. And our index was based on surveys sent out to CEOs around the world. In 2010, we had over 400 CEOs responding to this instrument. This year, we're in the process of actually processing that data. We'll release it as a 2013 report later this year. And we have over 500 CEOs from around the world that have responded. And it's pretty evenly distributed between North America, South America, Europe, and Asia. And it provides some fascinating insights as to what CEOs believe matters from a competitiveness standpoint, where they're going. But the face-to-face interviews were even more important to really understanding from an American perspective, what is it we have to do. We've also done a number of things with the Manufacturing Institute. For 3 years in a row, what will now be 4 years in a row, we've done a survey of the American public. Sometimes, as those of you know, in Washington, we can get so tangled up inside the Beltway, talking to policymakers and talking to subject matter experts that we debate things, but we thought it would be really interesting. We went out and asked the American public what they thought, and we've done this for 3 years in a row, and those report findings are available. But in general, the American public is overwhelmingly supportive of manufacturing. They believe it's critical to our economic prosperity. They believe it's critical to our national security. If they had an opportunity to grow 1,000 jobs in their community, they pick the manufacturing industry over all other industries. The issue that we had, and we continue to find in the data, is they just don't want to do those jobs. And there's a number of reasons that lead to why they reach those conclusions. But in general, manufacturing has overwhelming support from the American public, more so than we believe that policymakers in general really understand. But this data and this research has started to see more and more. It's getting more and more visibility over the last several years, and again, we'll continue it because it's been consistent, amazingly consistent through the downturn and through the recovery. We've also worked with the Institute to do a skills gap study. Our most recent one was published late last year, 2011, looking at from the perspectives of business leaders, companies, whether we have a skills gap in the United States, and in what particular areas, and how severe that is. And that's gotten a tremendous amount of visibility over the last 9 months or so since it was released. So we've looked at this from a variety of areas. And then finally, more recently, and a lot of what we'll be talking about today, is the work that we've been doing for the World Economic Forum. The forum has wanted to expand their research work. They work with outside organizations like ourselves. They actually make us compete with each other so that we can earn the right to do the work with the forum. And we were privileged to win the work for last year, which was a project called The Future of Manufacturing. We've also, again, had to compete and won the work for this year, and it's a project called Manufacturing for Growth. The forum does an excellent job of convening world leaders and business leaders, and to provide the platform for productive dialogues. And our Future of Manufacturing report was really a look at the broad number of trends that are shaping manufacturing, and to get to a data-driven dialogue that shows both policymakers and business leaders what's really happening in the manufacturing world, manufacturing ecosystem. Manufacturing for Growth is an attempt to actually get input from CEOs around the world. So we've selected 6 target countries: the US, Germany, and Japan as surrogates for developed nations, and India, China, and Brazil for the surrogates for emerging market nations. We're doing face-to-face interviews with CEOs in those countries, and we're doing a number of other threads of research, roundtables, et cetera, to get their input on the same topic. What would it take to bolster manufacturing competitiveness? How important is it? And really to try to get the foundation for a better dialogue with policy leaders. So what does all this research tell us? Well, before I went forward with that, I wanted to acknowledge the invaluable input we had from our partners on the World Economic Forum project in that last year's effort, the Future of Manufacturing. And we just had tremendous executive participation. We had tremendous scholarly input, and the report which is available on the World Economic Forum's website, and you can download a PDF version of it. We can also send you hard copies of it. Is about a 100-page report looking at this from a very data analytical perspective, and I think you'll find it fascinating. But again, it wouldn't have been possible without the contributions of this very large team. So when we say what defines a country's competitiveness, we can look at this through a number of lenses. Some of the most interesting work we found during our Future of Manufacturing work for the World Economic Forum came from Harvard and MIT. Professors Ricardo Hausmann and Cesar Hidalgo have been doing work for the past several decades, really, and they're looking at how complex economies develop and evolve. And we went to their research because before we went into trying to understand the trends that were reshaping manufacturing, we wanted to figure out whether manufacturing still mattered. If it didn't matter, then we were doing a project that maybe we shouldn't be doing. And what we found was, as you know, you can find a lot of debate among economists and whether manufacturing matters and how important is it to the prosperity of a nation. So despite all the other input we had, we thought we'd see if we can look at this through the lens of economists. And admittedly, we were shopping for an answer that said, could we find something that's clear enough and compelling enough that tells us whether we're headed in the right direction or this is still a subject that matters. And their work clearly shows that manufacturing is essential to the development of prosperity among a nation. They've looked at trade data, exported manufacturing goods, and they have information on every nation in the world for the past 50 or 60 years. And in a very visual way, they can show how economies develop, how different industry sectors come together in the development of capabilities within a country, and how those capabilities are pieced together to create advanced products or more advanced products from wherever you're at. So an advanced product for you may be textiles based on where you're at a particular point in time, and for other nations, it's significantly more advanced products, the way we think about it. But in general, what their data says is that the advancement of manufacturing capabilities is directly linked to increasing the economic prosperity for a nation. In fact, they found that it is the most compelling and most significant driver of economic prosperity for a nation. And it's a better predictor of how a nation will do over the long term in terms of economic prosperity than anything else. They talk about economic complexity, and they talk about complexity being good. As manufacturers, we think that's a bad thing. We do everything we can to avoid complexity, so it's a message that's kind of passing in the night, because they're supporting the notion that manufacturing is essential, but they're talking about it in terms that manufacturers shun, which is we don't like complexity. But in terms of an economy, what they mean is a robust economy that allows for the development of skills, the accumulation of knowledge, the development of skills and capabilities to create more advanced product sets that can be used as a stepping stone to even greater advanced products and greater capabilities. That's the driver of economic prosperity. And they map that out in such a way through what part of what you see up there right now on the slide is what they call their product network maps. They also have tree maps, and those are particular economies. What you're seeing there is Thailand, a snapshot in 1988 and 2008, and on the next page I'll show you a few more snapshots of the same thing. But fundamentally, what they show is that many emerging market economies are primed for growth. That they've been in a process of accumulating knowledge and capability sets that positions them in many ways beyond what they're able to do today. While we're seeing them producing some advanced product sets today, they're actually positioned to produce a much greater set of advanced products in the future. And as a result, advanced manufacturing and advanced product sets is really where the future is all about. It's the key driver of economic prosperity. All nations that are trying to drive their economies forward to create greater prosperity for their citizens are pursuing a similar path. And the data is absolutely overwhelming. So the message for emerging market economies is to pick wisely. There is no specific single path through picking capabilities or accumulating knowledge to develop capabilities. There's a variety of different ways through these maps and matrices that drive economic prosperity. For developed nations, though, the message is very clear that competitors are being formed around the world, and that you must continue to advance your own capabilities if you expect to be able to continue to drive prosperity. So when we look a little bit more broadly, these are both the tree maps and the product network maps. I think the tree maps, which are on the top, are a little bit more visual, graphical way to look at the development of capabilities. And I realize in the few minutes that we have here, this would be very hard to digest. But again, this is based on trade data. And the colors represent different products. So when you look at the tan products, for example, you're actually looking more at an agricultural economy. The light blue and the blues tend to be electronics and advanced machinery. So you see a number of things where they're looking at what that country is making and what it's able to export, meaning it's competitive enough to export on a global stage, which is really their test of figuring out whether it's significant and meaningful. If somebody in another country is willing to buy it, if you can export it, if it possesses both the capabilities and the cost, the price points to be able to be competitive on a global stage, then it becomes an integral part of their product set and their economy. And you can see Thailand's one of probably the most interesting studies because it's so clear from 1968 to 1988 to 2008, and you watch those colors change, and you watch that economy change from really an agrarian society to one that's producing advanced manufacturing products. This same picture will play out for virtually any country in the world. It happens at different speeds. You're seeing, in some cases, different products. The colors will come up differently because they have more or less of a particular product they're capable of doing. But the commonality across countries and the pattern of developing and accumulating knowledge and advanced manufacturing capabilities is overwhelmingly clear in virtually any country that you pick, with a couple of exceptions. And those couple of exceptions are at the developed economy nation. They actually calculate an index, the Economic Complexity Index. We see it down there at the bottom called the ECI Index. And in most cases, for all those countries that are accumulating knowledge and capabilities, they're also developing a more significant ECI index, Economic Complexity Index. The only place we've seen some reduction in that ECI happens to be in the United States and the United Kingdom. So when you look at developed nations, they stand out for an economic complexity index that is actually reversing its direction, and it seems to be directly related to the loss of manufacturing capabilities. Certainly for the United Kingdom, it's more pronounced than it was for the United States, but those stand out in terms of creating negative values more recently over the last 20 years than the positive trajectories you see everywhere else in the world. So what you see is kind of what we're trying to portray here is you see many nations, in this case we've got Brazil, China, Thailand, driving advanced product growth through the accumulation of knowledge and capabilities, and in turn it's driving significant economic growth. And again, I would encourage you to go to this book. It's called The Atlas of Economic Complexity. It's available on a website, free. It's hundreds of pages. It's 97% all charts and graphs, country by country by country, snapshots of what's available. And I know that they'd be happy to talk to you if you have any particular questions. We see advancing manufacturing capabilities through other surrogates. This was a recent snapshot that Bloomberg Business Week had presented that showed that the Chinese are continuing to develop and strengthen advanced manufacturing equipment or advanced equipment. All the data points to the same thing, whether it's economic trade data or whether it's this snapshot of looking at Chinese exports, Chinese manufacturing, but it's the same thing in other nations in the world. Those where the economies are doing well, where growth is happening, where prosperity is increasing, are following the formula toward increasing manufacturing productivity. So we've talked a little bit about the implications, but I'll jump down to the bottom to kind of speed this up. Clearly, the overwhelming conclusion from this research was the development of advanced manufacturing capability sets and advanced products through a careful selection of strategic pathways can lead to greater prosperity for both countries and companies. So manufacturing and advanced manufacturing is a key driver for a country of competitiveness. But I'm going to switch gears a little bit, and I'm going to go into what do CEOs tell us. So for the Council on Competitiveness, when we do those global CEO surveys, we look at the data in four ways. You see three of those ways here. We look at the drivers of competitiveness, which is that little snapshot on the bottom left. We ask them what countries are most competitive today and in the future. And then we ask them, are there policy advantages or disadvantages in a particular nation that they believe are either contributing to or detracting from the competitiveness of that nation? So I'm going to give you a little snapshot out of this today. From a driver's perspective, at the top of the list, executives tell us that it's talent-driven innovation. We kind of coined that term because it's a combination of the availability and the quality of the talent that they have access to both scientists, researchers, engineers, as well as the production, the labor force, whether it has the skill set and the capabilities to help them drive their business, their advanced manufacturing processes, and to help them innovate. And innovation, being able to out-innovate your competitors is critical. So the combination of talent driving innovation is the number one driver they look at when they think about whether a country is competitive. And despite the importance of costs of labor and materials, which came in number 2, overwhelmingly, when they think about a facility location decision, when they think about the competitiveness of a nation, they think about its talent and its ability to help them innovate and achieve their innovation objectives. So the rest of the drivers, not that they're not important, they're very important. Cost of labor and materials, energy costs and policies jumped up to the 3rd position in 2010. It's actually dropped down a little bit from what we can see from the preliminary data, and we think that the efficiency efforts and the availability of different types of energy has taken if you will, the accelerator off of the importance of energy in the eyes of CEO, but it's still a very important driver of competitiveness, certainly for manufacturing organizations. And then obviously you get into some of the things that are directly in the hands of policymakers. Economic, trade, financial, and tax systems, they think, are critical drivers of competitiveness. So we've got, this report's available. A new one will be out, like I said, by the end of the year for 2013. It's going to show, since I've already looked at the data and we're in the process of writing it, it's going to show amazingly consistent results with a couple of notable exceptions. And I think energy will be one of those exceptions in terms of the change of position. But talent-driven innovation, a number of years after this report and data was collected, it's going to come out in exactly the same position. So they're consistent around the world, CEOs, and the input they provide in terms of what they believe drives a nation's competitiveness. It's talent, and it's the ability of that talent to help them innovate and be more competitive. So when we ask those same executive which countries are most competitive, this is the only quote-unquote index, and it's really an opinion index, but the reason we call it an index is because we go to great lengths to normalize the results and to remove cultural biases because CEOs in different parts of the world answer the same question differently, so we go to great means, statistical means, to try to normalize it and come up with a consistent, repeatable methodology. But what they tell us is that in 2010, they told us China they thought was the most competitive nation in the world, followed by India and the Republic of Korea, and then the United States. By 2015, they said that the most notable change was the United States dropping from 4th to 5th. That was the first real significant drop. And what you see is that 5 of the top 10 and 6 of the top 12 nations by 2015 are in Asia. And you see tremendous, if you look further down in the list, you see tremendous stress in Western Europe. By the way, this was in 2009-10, we were actually collecting the data. I don't think they had realized what was coming for Europe, and what we find in this year's data is even more concerning news for Europe, with the exception of Germany. And Germany continues to stand out as a beacon of manufacturing success, and it actually moves up on the list. I guess it's all about who you're standing next to, and Germany looks exceptionally bright. It's a bright star compared to its counterparts in Europe, and it's going to move up on the list considerably. But in general, what I can tell you, again, not a public release at this point, but it looks like the list is going to come out looking very similar, which says that the methodology is helping us produce repeatable results, and the CEOs are telling us the same thing about which nations are most competitive and what they believe happens another 5 years out. And they continue to forecast that the U.S., despite where it is today, its competitiveness erodes. So in 2010, they told us that U.S. competitiveness is likely to erode over the next 5 years. They're going to tell us that again this year. So executives, and oftentimes we've been critiqued, we'll say, about this can't possibly be right because it's only based on executive perceptions. But again, we started this because we were unhappy with really some of the efforts that others were doing around the world that were heavily based on data, and told us Switzerland was the most competitive nation in the world, and we really didn't see ourselves losing any jobs, manufacturing jobs, to Switzerland. We saw us losing jobs to other parts of the world, and we saw the competition between other nations. And at the end of the day, since I work with these executives, that's kind of my day job, is to actually work with companies and help them improve their competitiveness. And with CEOs, what we do know is that they actually do make the decisions. Their companies make the decisions, whether they're right or wrong as to who really is the most competitive. Their perceptions and their insights based on actually doing business in these countries drives their decisions about where they're going to put new plant equipment and facilities. So their perspectives, almost more than anything else, matters. You can show them all sorts of data about labor productivity and other means, but at the end of the day, if they believe strongly and they have compelling experience that would say a particular nation is or is not competitive and it helps them achieve their objectives or not, they're going to write the checks to put the facilities in the locations that they believe are going to help them achieve their goals. And I think that's why we look to them in this competitiveness index as one of the most compelling and important aspects of defining who is or is not most competitive. So now I'm going to try to go through what the trends are that are shaping manufacturing. I'm going to draw upon the research from the World Economic Future of Manufacturing effort. And I'm going to go through this again fairly quickly, largely because the reports that you're going to download is over 100 pages. And I was saying before this presentation that actually takes about 4 hours to walk through all the charts and the graphs and the data. And that's if I move kind of at the pace I'm moving now, which is pretty steady pace for 4 hours. And I've done that presentation for 4 hours, and you're going to get the 10-minute version, which means you're going to get a lot less slides, and we're going to hit some of the highlights of that. But I encourage you to download that to take a look at it. But if we kind of look at one of the questions I was asked and I get asked often, what's happened since you wrote that book 20 years ago or more on the world-class manufacturing and America's 21st Century Challenge? And I think there have really been a number of things that have happened, but these four stand out, right? The one was an explosion of free trade proliferation, right? We got stuck in not being able to, and we're still stuck, not having a successful Doha round of trade negotiations, and countries kind of took it upon themselves to do bilateral trade agreements, largely, kind of trading, setting that up, and that process, it's kind of like we let the genie out of the bottle, and I don't know that we'll ever actually put it all back in, reconcile it. Most companies, most executives would prefer to have a consistent, clear, comprehensive trade agreement that was compelling for the world and for nations. In the absence of that, though, they didn't stand still, and they've negotiated trade agreements country to country that are compelling for a particular industry, for a particular sector, and that just exploded. And the data is, we've actually got some charts in this report that show the number of free trade agreements that were in place 20 years ago, and then 10 years ago, and then now, and you can just watch it explode in terms of what's happened. And we complain in this country about not moving fast enough, not having enough of them, not being compelling enough, but the data is pretty clear that establishing free trade lanes between nations is essential, and that's been one of the real drivers that has changed manufacturing over the last, and globalized manufacturing very rapidly over the last 20 years. The second thing we saw was the advent of and the explosion of digital technology infrastructures, which really means the computerized information technology has exploded on the scene in a way that we had really didn't completely anticipate. And what it's allowed us to do are two things that are essential. One is it allows us as manufacturers to automate a process. It's no longer that Bridgeport lathe operator. We like to talk about the artisan at the machine center. It really is a computerized process. It's a computer numerically controlled machine, but it's taken it to new levels. And a manufacturer can now put a plant that looks and operates identically any place in the world. You can walk into a facility that Chrysler Fiat has or Fiat Chrysler has in Italy, and you can walk into one in the northern suburbs of Detroit, and you will not know where you're at. It looks like the same plant. It'll come up identical. You might notice the difference in the workers on the line, but otherwise you wouldn't know whether you were in one country or the other. And manufacturers have gotten very good at being able to repeat manufacturing processes using technology, using information technology, digital technology, to allow them to replicate facilities and to put them in the locations that give them the greatest advantage based on other dimensions. The other thing it's allowed them to do is to move design and information data around the world very rapidly, right? When we were doing that book, 20-some years ago, we certainly didn't have the internet, and we were lucky to have a computer to kind of bang out a written copy of things. When you move to today and you look at how rapidly digital technology allows us to move design data and product design data and research information and to bring it back, literally into the making of a product. And if you add to that some of the other capabilities, additive manufacturing, taking coated, powdered things and printing products, all on the basis of what we can do with information technology, digital technologies. So that's exploded over the last 20 years. That's also fueled the ability of other nations, particularly in Asia, to get into the manufacturing game. So you've got the rise of the global middle class, where dramatically the numbers are just overwhelming and compelling, that middle class shifts to Asia. It's already shifted to Asia, and if you look over at the next 20 to 25 years, it's dramatic, right? The purchasing power parity of nations in Asia, particularly China and India, are growing dramatically, and the middle class, as we've known it for the last 100 years, or certainly when Woodrow Wilson was the president of the United States, has shifted, and it's not coming back, right? The population, the numbers are pretty compelling. The one thing about the demographics are it's very easy to predict out, where the people are going to be 25, 50, even almost 100 years from now. So you can follow those patterns pretty clearly. And the rise of the middle class around the world has been dramatic. And then all of that has led to a global disaggregation of manufacturing supply chains. And we'll talk about what that means, but really it means that we were able to take a manufacturing process that was physically co-located, say, in the United States, and we could break that up. We could break up design, engineering, manufacturing. We could break up the supply chain. We could break out the partners that provided the materials and the components, and we could put them in different parts of the world that allowed us to get an advantage, typically a cost advantage, but sometimes other advantages. That wasn't as possible prior to those free trade agreements and prior to those digital technology infrastructure exploding. But all of that, plus finding that ready and capable workforce in other parts of the world, has allowed manufacturers to disaggregate those supply chains. Whether it made any sense to disaggregate them, different question. But they certainly had the opportunity to do it, and they did it to a very large extent, and it became self-feeding. When we look at it through other terms, right, those last 20 years, this is what manufacturing looked like on a national basis from 1990 to 2000. On the horizontal axis, you've got manufacturing GDP, compounded annual growth rate over that time period, and on the vertical axis, you've got manufacturing GDP in billions of dollars, and the size of the bubble represents the percentage that manufacturing represents of the total gross domestic product. So the U.S. has a very sizable manufacturing economy. It wasn't necessarily a huge portion. It was a significant portion, but it wasn't a huge portion of the U.S. economy. China was growing at a very rapid growth rate, as did other nations. Much more significant portion of their overall gross domestic product. But it still wasn't significant. It was growing. It was certainly moving up the vertical axis. That was between 1990 and 2000. A lot of things happening. Notice that the U.S. and Japan have positive growth rates. They're moved out from that axis in this direction. And again, China's out here, and you've got a number of, if you notice, there's a number of what we call, at that point in time, developing nations, certainly developing manufacturing powerhouses, Korea, Mexico, Thailand, Malaysia, et cetera. When we look at this from 2000 to 2009, those things continued to accelerate, and China became the largest manufacturing economy, edging out the U.S. By the way, it hasn't slowed down its growth rate any. It's actually become as significant or more significant portion of the economy. And what's even more interesting was how the U.S. and Japan in particular, their growth rates slowed down dramatically from a manufacturing GDP perspective. Only Germany, somewhere, you start to see the data in this time period, and that now it's even more pronounced in terms of what's happening in Germany, starts to both move in the right-hand direction, meaning they're growing more rapidly, and the size of their manufacturing GDP in terms of absolute dollars measured in U.S. dollars is starting to grow. So those trends, what we talked about in terms of what was reshaping global supply chains, this is what it looks like if you're looking at it through a national lens of GDP and growth rates. This is how it plays out. For the U.S., it had some, and for developed nations in general, but this is really the U.S., it had some pretty profound effects. So what we're looking at here is part of, is one of the components of what we call the shift index, and it's put out by our Center for the Edge, and inside that shift index, which is done by John Seeley Brown and John Hagel, who work with Deloitte, in our Center for the Edge, they look at how the major trends are shaping or shifting in the world. This is a component that looks at return on asset performance, and this is the top quartile of companies over this time period, 1965 to 2010. And you can see even for the top quartile of performing companies, it has not been a rosy picture for performance, for return on assets. And particularly if you look in that this right-hand side, you look at what's happened from, say, 1990, this last 20 years, to 2010, you have pretty much a downward trajectory on most of these, except for consumer products, and these are the best performing companies, right? These are the best performing U.S. companies. Aerospace and defense. If you look at if you look at the bottom quartile companies, you can see where there was tremendous stress. So during this period of rapid globalization of manufacturing, U.S. manufacturers were experiencing this. And those at the bottom of the list, or at the bottom quartile performers, were rapidly eroding their performance, at least from an ROA perspective. So you can see that globalization, all those things that happened, that disaggregated supply chains and moved and grew China's economy, and you saw the U.S. growth rate in GDP just step back a little. It's not as profound when you look at it through that lens as when you start to look at it through this lens. So disaggregation had a lot of impact. It's not completely clear. It always had the greatest and most positive impact. In fact, the data is pretty overwhelming. That didn't necessarily have a great positive impact on U.S. companies as they looked at their performance. So again, the disaggregated global supply chain, no longer do you have to make, design, produce a product in a single country. You can now put the product around the world. You can have headquarters in one location. You can have design centers in other locations. You can have suppliers around the world. And it really has allowed us to, it's fueled this rapid growth in the middle class in Asia. It's given them jobs, important jobs. It's allowed that Harvard and MIT data research to come to life, right? All those nations in the world are benefiting from this as they develop knowledge and manufacturing capabilities. But something's changed. Well, first of all, before I go to the something's changed, the Boeing 787 Dreamliner, this information is publicly available. This is a great example. If you would go back to Boeing 20-some years ago, there was a portion of their airplanes that were being made outside the U.S., probably more than anyone understood at the time. But when you look at this and you look closely at where this plane is being made, it is a case study in the global disaggregation of supply chains, right? For something that we think of as an extremely American product, a bellwether of a company in terms of when we think of our manufacturing prowess and our advanced capabilities. Korea, Australia, Italy, France, Japan, Italy. There's Kansas, I think that's in this country still. Japan, Sweden, Canada, UK, more Japan. It's an incredibly global product now. And this is just one of, by the way, we're actually doing this in our Manufacturing for Growth product or project for the World Economic Forum right now. We're looking at the same type of disaggregation across a number of different industry sectors. And then we're looking at how that disaggregation actually grows or contributes to job growth and what skill sets are necessary as manufacturers break down those supply chains and move jobs around the world. Is it good or bad for an economy? Because it's not black or white. We're never going back to the black or white scenario of pre-1990, all right? So, but we said that there are things changing and that those globally disaggregated supply chains are coming under pressure. And the fact that we can disaggregate them and put things anywhere in the world, using digital technologies and free trade agreements doesn't necessarily mean it was a good idea. So three things we're really seeing that are reshaping supply chains. We're seeing rising protectionist politics. Nations around the world are trying to figure out how to grow jobs in their economy, in their nation. And as a result, they are coming up with a variety of barriers and obstacles, and policymakers are getting more and more involved, not less involved, but more involved in trying to stimulate the economy, either directly or intuitively. They understand that manufacturing jobs are important for their country, and as a result, they're trying to do something that's positive, but that ultimately results in really kind of a protectionist politics, and that's playing out with CEOs as they see those barriers get put up, and that changes the way they think about their supply chains. So it's reshaping those supply chains. There's been tremendous concern about exposure to currency volatility. In Japan, I don't know if it's volatility or it's just long-term malaise, you now see significant manufacturing organizations leaving Japan to make their Japanese products somewhere else in Asia, somewhere else in the world. Toyota has been one of the most notable foot draggers, and finally even Toyota has now kind of given into the fact that the currency situation makes it really difficult or impossible for them to compete. That's just a currency problem that has been long-term, but currency volatility, those supply chains were disaggregated on this, and the notion that you'd have some stability in your costs. What executives have found is that that's not necessarily the case. When you disaggregate those supply chains and you put your products in different parts of the world, your suppliers in different parts of the world, you're now exposed to currency swings. And if those swings are dramatic, and manufacturing product profitability is driven at a kind of fairly thin margins, those currency switches have tremendous impacts. So they're moving away from volatile locations, which, by the way, makes the U.S. very attractive, despite some of the other issues that the U.S. may have. The currency situation makes the U.S. a very attractive place for manufacturing, and it creates a unique opportunity at this point in time and in our history to attract manufacturing and foreign direct investment. And you're also seeing fading labor rate arbitrage, meaning that those companies that went to Asia, particularly China, for low-cost labor have realized that that time is over, at least in China. In fact, a lot of the Chinese companies and the companies that went there are now looking at other parts of Asia and Southeast Asia for low-cost labor. But in general, the notion of chasing labor around the world, except for select industries, select sectors, has really started to fade away. And the use of low-cost labor strictly as your primary strategy has diminished, and as a result, now you're looking at those markets as markets for themselves, and you're looking at those markets as talent, and the talent that can help drive your innovation. So you've got a really new sort of frame that's changing supply chains, and what it appears as though it's doing is it's regionalizing supply chains. It's those largely flung out, disaggregated supply chains are being pulled back into regional centers. Regional might be North America or South America, or I would say Europe, but Europe doesn't look like really there's a lot of energy to invest in that, and it may be that way for a long period of time. But you're seeing, and those free trade agreements have shaped some of this, but you're seeing manufacturers now thinking about markets for the population that's there, for the consumers are there, for the talent that's there, and to reduce their exposure to both the protectionist politics that might block them from getting in, or to the exposure to the currency that's there. But they're not chasing that low-cost labor like they were a decade or more ago. So for the World Economic Forum, we came up with, now this is kind of the conclusion of 100 pages of a report that says, here's what we found. And we said that we came up with these elements that would define the future of manufacturing for both countries and companies. We said that infrastructure necessary to enable manufacturing to flourish and continue to grow will really grow in importance. It will never be the defining moment for manufacturing competitiveness. It's a necessary element to be able to compete. And having adequate or advanced infrastructure is important. Where the U.S. has a challenge is that many of these emerging market economies are developing infrastructure that is specific and unique to the industry sectors they want to be in. Unquestionably, the U.S. usually is considered to have the best infrastructure in the world, but it's a general infrastructure and it's an aging infrastructure. For specific industries, you can use a slightly different infrastructure. So port systems, harbor systems, et cetera, particularly ports and docks that are good for loading up a Caterpillar equipment aren't necessarily ideal for loading up a solar panel. And nations around the world that know what they're going to be good at and are developing the infrastructure, both physical and electronic and digital, that allow them to be competitive. The competition to attract FDI is going to increase. What that means is really that nations are becoming much more competitive. They're much more aggressive at marketing their capabilities to potential suitors, which are companies. They're more sophisticated in their techniques to being able to sell. There's more competition for where to go put your money and what nation to invest in. And normally these are long-term investments. One of the things I think policymakers often have trouble comprehending is that when business executives make decisions, they consider them for a long period of time, and once they plant property or they put plant and equipment down, it's there for a long period of time. So you've got to be able to intercept those decisions, and there are more countries competing for that FDI. That makes it harder, by the way, for companies to sort through the various marketing messages, the sales jobs that they're getting from nations around the world about why you should locate there. So their staffs are having to get much more sophisticated to be able to sort through it and to stay focused on the real drivers. There's clearly a growing materials resource competition. We've got a number of pages and a lot of research in the report that looks at where the shortages are for materials and what happens. But in general, what happens is that materials resource competition serves as a catalyst to what we believe are going to be significant material science breakthroughs, right? Shortages are only shortages for periods of time. There's always a mitigation strategy, and there's always an innovation strategy to kind of grow out or grow past that particular shortage. And it becomes a crisis in the near term, but over the long term, in general, most scientists look at all of whether it's rare earth elements or anything else, there's a strategy and a process that over time, there's there's an innovation that's out there that they're working on or moving toward to create a substitution for that. And because of the scarcity of so many resources, we see the net result of that will be innovation explosion, right? Material science innovation breakthroughs. Affordable clean energy strategies and effective energy policies will clearly become an important differentiator of highly competitive countries and companies. Energy only becomes more scarce. It becomes more costly as we go forward for manufacturers, particularly for energy-intensive manufacturing sectors. This is a key, if not the key driver. It's the most important factor of production, exceeding labor costs and other component or other material costs. Energy becomes critical to those organizations, and those nations that can develop a clean, affordable, stable, reliable energy supplies will definitely have an advantage in attracting manufacturing and growing competitive manufacturing bases. Fostering innovation is critical for GDP growth, both for nations and for companies. And as we said earlier, human capital. Companies struggling to fill manufacturing jobs with the right talent and access to human capital is going to become the most important. And then finally, what we talk about is the strategic use of public policy as an enabler. So we believe that as countries continue to become more active in the policy arena, as policymakers continue to try in a productive way, in an attempt to be productive at growing their economies, they're becoming more active. And the notion of implementing industrial policies has returned to being a favorable thing. We've had a number of failed industrial policies in different locations in the world. In this country, even the term industrial policy is kind of a lightning rod. We don't pick winners or losers in this country, but other nations do. They certainly pick winners. And we as a nation, we really have to look at what does a comprehensive manufacturing strategy, manufacturing policy, what does it entail? And if it's not full-blown industrial policy, we at least have to recognize that growing manufacturing capabilities, growing advanced manufacturing capabilities, and using policy in a way that advantages that nation is becoming very significant in other nations in the world. And there's nothing that suggests that it's going to slow down. This is the future as we know it and as we see it. And policymakers in other parts of the world you pick your favorite nation, will do whatever makes sense to advantage their population, to advantage their economy, to grow at the margin. And they're becoming more sophisticated in the world of trade and negotiations to be able to do that. So Ken, I'm actually going to stop there based on the time. I have another probably several dozen slides that go into this in a little bit more detail. but I think that this provides you an overview, and I think I'll save the part on what high-performing companies do, and maybe I'll get asked back if you enjoyed this. So I appreciate your attention here today, and I hope you can see where the trends of the future of manufacturing are going and what what our research is showing us so far.
Terrific, terrific. We'll consider it an invitation issued to have you back, absolutely. Yes. Yes, we're also webcasting, and I should have welcomed all the people watching on the web, and we will also post that. Probably will take a week before we'll have the speech up on the web. Now, you're
Mind if I sit?
please.
Stay here so I can see.
Hi, I'm Naini Gupta. I'm from the Science and Technology Policy Institute. I hope everyone can hear me.
Right in the
Yes, thank
microphone
you.
there.
So first of all, thank you. That was a fantastic report and an amazing talk. I think you've pointed out a large number of very, very, important trends and important things for people to be thinking about. I think it's very significant that the report sort of firmly calls out the relationship between manufacturing activity and economic prosperity, and that manufacturing activity sort of leads to the complexity, the economic complexity that moves the country up what we call the value chain. And we talk in terms of the ecosystem, the manufacturing ecosystem, but the product space that you demonstrate, that you visualize in your report really clearly demonstrates that, and that I really enjoyed that. Other, I think, very important points that you called out were the intense competition and the emergence of manufacturing in the sort of the emerging countries are not only getting it competitive, they are getting innovative, they're using their resources well, and they're sort of, now it's not so much the competition for everything from resources to talent to innovation is global. So one of the things that we found in some of our work was some of the emerging countries, notably China and India, sometimes it appears that they seek not so much to copy exactly what their Western counterparts are doing, but to sort of drive towards more of a self-sufficiency route. So China has a policy of indigenous innovation, and their thought is that instead of necessarily being at the cutting edge of every single technology, that they seek to develop technologies to the point of self-sufficiency, and if it's good enough for their market, then that's what they'll go with. And that makes the competition for emerging markets a tough competition, because the countries are figuring out how to corner their markets better than maybe the leading technology supplier out there. So China has indigenous innovation. India has what they call frugal innovation, which is doing the same amount of innovation at a lower cost and good enough to satisfy their domestic market, not necessarily being at the cutting edge all the time. The third thing that I wanted to point out was the sort of intense talent-driven innovation leading to sort of a global competition for talent. And one of the interesting things here, and as actually Ken pointed out the other day, one of the strengths that the United States has is we have a fantastic higher education system. And what we really need to do is to figure out how to keep the talent that comes out of the higher education system into providing or producing innovation for the United States instead of leaving the country in larger numbers. And there are several issues here. There's immigration, there are opportunities, there are the markets, there's sort of the country, the pull of the home country. But in all of these, I think there is a significant role for policymakers to ensure that the product of U.S. higher education sort of participates in building the manufacturing strength in the U.S. I also wanted to point out that in April this year, the Science and Technology Policy Institute released a report on, it was Emerging Global Trends in Advanced Manufacturing. It's right here, if I may just show it off. But we did call out some trends in manufacturing as well, a lot of it very complementary to this report. But in some places, maybe our report was a little more technical. So there were some places where we called out a few things that were also interesting, and I just wanted to make a couple of comments on that, if you don't mind. So I think the overarching finding of our report was that establishing an advanced manufacturing sector is a priority now for all countries. Everyone's in the competition, everyone's putting in the full force of public policy, of financial, financial investment, regulation, and everything that they possibly can bring to bear to build up an advanced manufacturing sector. The most important factor that influences where companies seek to locate and where they seek to invest their in their future growth depends on market size, which is a Deloitte finding. And so the markets in emerging countries are essentially the largest, the locations of largest growth for the next 3 to 5 years, or possibly even further out. And of next importance in countries locating towards it, countries finding new locations are proximity to suppliers and access to a skilled labor force. So the developing of the supply chain, not just suppliers, but also tooling and equipment, and all of the things that an industrial ecosystem needs, along with a talented workforce, is a precondition for companies seeking to invest in a country. And some of the trends that we called out in our report actually duplicate what Craig just spoke about: an increasing role for information technology and modeling and simulation. And this, of course, allows a much higher decoupling of R&D, design, engineering, and manufacturing, allows decoupling across the entire supply chain, allows companies to globalize and spread as much as they can. This also in the US, some growing trends in IT, notably cloud computing and the lowering cost of computing and storage, are democratizing IT access for small and medium-sized businesses, notably allowing them to access more and more modeling and simulation capability. And this is something that policymakers have actually been working on recently. The administration put out an advanced manufacturing initiative, and which called out for more help for small and medium-sized manufacturers to access modeling and simulation help. Other trends that we saw were an increasing tendency towards flexibility and mass customization across industries, using data generated from across the board, starting from the supply chain through customers, to allow companies to differentiate themselves and become more competitive. We also wonder if mass customization signals a return towards more localized manufacturing, at least in some sectors, and what that means for the US is hopefully that is an advantage in most sectors. And finally, supply chain innovation continues to be increasingly important, not just in terms of the actual sort of supply chain as we traditionally think of it, but also sourcing in innovation and ideas from the outside. So companies are increasingly looking outwards for everything, starting from the creative ideation and concept building down the supply chain and to the customization of finished products. So that's pretty much what I had.
Well, thank you very much. Is there a website where they could access that report?
Yes. So actually, just right now, I could tell you that if you Googled Emerging Global Trends in Advanced Manufacturing and Institute for Defense Analyses, you would reach the website where our report is uploaded. But I will also send Kent a link, and he can send it out.
That's great. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you.
Well, we've gotten a good taste of competition, the importance of innovation, The kind of talent that we have assembled in this room is going to be critical for the future. Let's open it up for questions now. We have microphones, and let's start with this gentleman here, and then the Mr. Jarbo, and then we'll come back to this side, the gentleman there, and then Mitzi. And please wait for the microphone, and please identify yourself.
James Sang. Can I have two disaggregating questions to Cliff in detail? You talked about innovation, but innovation is a big word. It goes from everywhere from tweaking the process, being able to quickly tweak a process line so you get yield up, to new products, to completely new markets. Do your surveys show an indication of whether one or another of those kinds of innovations are more important in the short and near term? And the second one is your surveys of competitiveness. You just have CEOs. If you look at CEOs of large companies versus small companies, of software versus consumer appliance, do they in fact give you different reads on the competitiveness of different countries?
Let me take the second question first. The data set includes CEOs from companies of all sizes, and we have a normalizing and a weighting process for those with more global experience than not. But generally, the answer to your question is that they're on almost all of the attributes of what drives competitiveness, what countries are most competitive. They're very consistent. So when we normalize, we look for things that would drive variation. Company size is not one of the things that changes the results. So they're pretty consistent. The data is statistically very clear that would say size is not a differentiator. When it comes to innovation, we actually tried to stay out of the almost religious debate of what constitutes innovation. Inside of our firm, we actually have some innovation zealots that talk about what is an innovation, what is a breakthrough innovation. We found that, as you pointed out, that the topic is a little bit looser in the real world, and it gets really diluted or polluted by innovations of a minor sort, particularly a marketing gimmick that we see in consumer products often. But generally, they're meaningful breakthroughs that allow you to compete differently through the product space or through the process, through a manufacturing process. If we, the very next slide, because I actually stopped at some point in that deck, was looking at manufacturing innovation. And we decided rather than defining innovation, we would take other sources that said, however they got there, let's look at companies that have been defined as most innovative. And we found that, when you looked across all sectors, which is the top left-hand slide, more innovative companies, whether it was they were on the list, on somebody's list, a Business Week list, a Forbes list, a university's list of most innovative companies, and we kind of consolidated those. We saw across all sectors they outperformed their competition, both in terms of revenue and net income and market capitalization. When we looked at manufacturing companies in particular, they didn't necessarily outperform in terms of revenue growth. So what we found were in manufacturing, you had a disparity between very large companies that weren't necessarily very innovative, but they were still very large and they were still able to drive revenue growth. But when you looked at the performance of those most innovative companies in manufacturing, they definitely outperformed their peers in terms of net income and market capitalization. So the ability to innovate, however it gets defined, right? You stay out of that religious debate as to what really defines innovation. And you look at all the measures, you would say that there's something there, right? I can't necessarily pinpoint which innovations drive the most success, but we know that, the story is pretty consistent.
Ken? Right there.
Thank you. Ken Jarbo with Athena Alliance. Quick comment and a question. The first point on your previous slide, I think often gets lost, and it's the first time I actually heard it. There's a lot of general discussion about infrastructure, but it's very general. And your point about it being industry specific,
right.
Ports for heavy equipment versus ports for solar panels, is something that I haven't heard in the policy debate at all in this town.
Not in this country anyway.
And I think it's an important point to draw out, and we don't lose it. So thank you very much for that point.
Thank you.
The question is to actually all of the panel. You know, in the IDA report, you talk a lot about the changes in manufacturing processes. So we've got additive manufacturing coming in. We've got user-driven innovation where the users are co-designing. We've got the do-it-yourself
Yes.
movement going on. Tying that back to what the folks at Harvard MIT did about complexity, I'm a big fan of their economic complexity because it really is a measure of the knowledge base and the intangible assets built in the product. But it's built around, as far as I understand, how difficult it is to make the product. So crude oil is lower on the scale than lubricants.
Right.
If we move to these new types of manufacturing, additive manufacturing and changes in manufacturing process, does that change and then all of a sudden countries that couldn't do things on that complexity scale all of a sudden can leapfrog up, so now everybody with additive manufacturing, for example, can make highly complex products? And is that a new dynamic in the competitiveness?
Well, one of the interesting things about their data is they haven't yet analyzed it. We'd like to work with them. We're trying to work with them to say, is there a path through? Is there at least a heuristic, if not an optimal path through to make those leaps? And in general, one, they haven't analyzed it that way, and two, nothing clearly is emerging. Right? That there are. But one thing is clear is that you can't make a leap that's too large, right? So the notion of going from crude oil to additive manufacturing, which, by the way, we see different nations, particularly Middle Eastern nations, that want to get into the manufacturing game, trying to figure out how to get from oil to advanced manufacturing, and they're finding it very difficult. And it's difficult because there is a process of accumulation of knowledge and the development of capabilities that builds on itself, and that some leaps are reasonable and others simply don't happen. So one would say that it's not going to happen overnight, right? And different countries are going to make different leaps, and some of them are going to leap, and the data is pretty clear. You can leap into kind of a blind alley, right? You can get to a spot and you say, okay, that didn't help me. I can't get from here to somewhere else. And you don't really know it, and certainly policymakers don't know it. So there's a lot of information that's in there that would say, what are those blind alley paths that they haven't analyzed yet, or at least based on history? Broader answer to your question would say, is everybody going to get those capability sets at some point? And the answer is, yeah, probably, right? It's like if you believe in where the universe ultimately kind of decays into cold and no, it's the same type of thing. If you take this out far enough, it's all about relativity, though, right? Competition is a game of where are you at a point in time and over a certain window, and so the long-term answer is yes, but by then there'll be something else, and since those paths are very unclear, as to how you get from point A to point B, other than some of the tenets of talent and information technology and advanced, the use of those things together to generate, next generation products and capabilities, that's probably the only, the clear answer, other than if you look down the road far enough, yep, you'll be there.
Mayani, a comment?
Sure. So a couple of things, again, more sort of from the technology angle. If you think of additive manufacturing and sort of synthetic biology and technologies like that, one aspect is that they're clearly disruptive. It's a different way of doing things. A second aspect is that despite being disruptive, I do think that there is sort of this value chain ladder up, that they would go up. So for example, additive manufacturing technologies are and will start out as being mostly used for producing parts or prototyping. So it's sort of an enhancing function or an enhancing technology to a larger manufacturing enterprise. But the thought is that it moves into the space of actually manufacturing products. There again, there's a whole ecosystem. So manufacturing, additive manufacturing for plastics is different from metals, is different, so there are these different domains. Then you have the issues of standards and interoperability and the material quality and texture. You have several layers of, I guess, technological sophistication that are, that this technology is sort of moving in the direction of, but there is still a lot to go. And so in that sense, I do feel that it still fits in with the way that the economists have described product spaces and the evolution of product spaces and the benefits that it gives you. In the eventual, I guess, dream is that additive manufacturing is able to be significantly disruptive to manufacturing itself. That is really, I guess it's anybody's, shot to call. But I do feel that it still does, it follows some of the patterns of what other sectors and what other technologies are going through and continue to need to go through.
I was just going to add to that. If you look at all interesting major product innovations, we talk about product innovations, it's really so many of them are really based on process innovation, right? It's manufacturing process, the computer chip, and and I think the same thing happens with additive manufacturing. And it's a different kind of process, but if you can scale that up rapidly, right, very rapidly, and you can actually scale up to be able to produce large number of parts and do it quickly in larger envelopes, then it becomes extremely disruptive. And to be able to do that, it's going to be a combination of really the process of making it. There's really no limit almost on the possibility on product. So manufacturing innovation, product innovation in particular, is highly tied to process development, which is why, somebody may ask that question, why manufacturing, research, engineering, we've come full circle and realized the co-location of those things is so important. We had so much input on that. We, again, you didn't see up here today, but certainly from national lab leaders in those face-to-face interviews, they were so clear and so passionate about the need to co-locate physically manufacturing processes and their research capabilities, because they informed each other and they made each other better. And I think some of that will play out in these equations of process innovation that allows those types of things to scale very quickly or not.
The gentleman right there.
Thank you, Raymond Barrett with PAR. Maybe a question on how, say, U.S. companies can compete with SOEs when maybe that's slightly distorting the landscape. And you mentioned industrial policy. And is it time for, say, U.S. companies to actually take industrial policy as part of one of the ways to increase their competitiveness? And is it best done through a sort of, say, combative approach at the WTO, or maybe trying to engage people at the TPP to sort of, say, minimize the anti-competitive effects of SOEs?
Well, I'll take
ahead and start.
a stab at that question. I think it really is a challenge for us. We're going to look at that challenge. Here's a commercial for the future. On August 8th, Ambassador Moranis, who's very engaged with the TPP process, the Trans-Pacific Partnership negotiations, part of which is targeted at the question of state-owned enterprises and how we respond to them. You might say more broadly that the initial post-World War II system was based on two assumptions: that there would be limited state involvement, interference in markets, and that by and large we would have a competitive set of companies working in competitive markets, and we would set then rules of the game for that kind of world. You could argue that really starting with Japan and the rise of what many refer to as the East Asian miracle worked on a whole different set of assumptions in which the state was more actively engaged in driving the economy forward, where industrial policy was actually a very active part of the growth strategy rather than a word that you couldn't use in polite company. So one could look at the TPP negotiations as a major effort to create a set of rules of the game that take account of aspects of the East Asian miracle, hoping to bring them in to a standard that everyone would accept. It may or may not work. I've sometimes wonder if we're not a little like let's say Harvard calling Ohio State and saying, gosh, could you drop spring practice and let's get rid of those athletic scholarships. We want to have a level playing field. And Ohio State says, well, thank you for your advice, but we'll see you in the Rose Bowl maybe sometime next century. So I think it's a major question that you pose, and I think we as a country are wrestling with it. Mitzi, if you wait for the microphone.
I'm really into process. I'm Mitzi Wertheim with the Naval Postgraduate School, but I was lucky enough to spend 13 years at IBM when all of this stuff was starting on manufacturing change. And anyway, I think where we're really failing on our educational system is we don't teach process, we don't teach systems, we don't teach context, and we don't teach consequences. And I think that puts us at a real disadvantage in terms of the kinds of needs and the speed with which we can move forward. I was really impressed with your talk, and my question is, can you write it up so an 11-year-old can understand it? And the reason for that question is that Alan Alda did this wonderful thing back in '08. He linked up with Stony Brook University, and when he was an 11-year-old, he asked what was a flame. So they set up a worldwide contest to explain what's a flame. 6,000 kids, 11-year-olds from around the world, did the evaluation. But the point is, you have a very complex story, and you have to figure out a way to tell it so not only the voters, but the people on Capitol Hill understand what their responsibilities are if we want to move forward.
I agree with you wholeheartedly in terms of repackaging the message so that both the public and that policymakers can get it. Our data, when we survey the American public, like I said, they're overwhelmingly supportive of manufacturing, and they want those jobs to be manufacturing. But I also said they don't want to do them, and
Well, they don't even know what it means.
right. So when you probe deeper into the survey, you start to find those types of issues. I think, and unfortunately, policymakers often, if you look at their backgrounds, don't come from manufacturing backgrounds, don't come from science and technology backgrounds. So it's, they want to understand but don't necessarily get there. We've recently become a sponsor of FIRST, which is, I think if I remember the acronym correctly, which is for interest in, I don't know.
Inspiration
For
and
inspiration.
recognition of
Thank you.
science and technology.
Thank you very much. The kids, they attract kids to develop, robots that compete, and
I
we have
get it.
tons
I'm
of
talking
fun.
about voters.
Well,
And if they don't understand it, I mean, I had this wonderful line that I got from Congressman Roscoe Bartlett, who's a Republican in Virginia, and I was lamenting to him about how uninformed the public is. And his comment was, gee, they're really well represented on the Hill. And so if you think of the complex questions that they ought to be dealing with, but have none of the foundation for doing it, our media is failing us as a way to educate the public. And I now have this charge that I want to get all academics who get federal funding to write their report for an 11-year-old so the rest of us can understand what they're saying. I mean, I've worked for think tanks. You produce reports and nobody reads them.
Right.
They're written for other academics. They're not written to educate the public. And we now need to figure out a way to start educating the public so that they can vote right.
the last thing I'll say, though, was that, the survey on 1,000 average Americans consistently for 3 years, they understand this much better than we believe they would understand it, and better than policymakers. They understand manufacturing is important. They understand what our strengths are. They understand what our weaknesses are. They understand what policymakers are contributing or not contributing. They understand that the jobs are important. They're actually much further along. Policymakers simply aren't enacting their wishes if you look at this data. I'll be happy to send that to you. So they're closer than you would believe. We just need to get it to carry through to policy action.
Yeah, I mean, I thought the infrastructure piece that you pointed out is the list of your things of what needs to be in place for it to work. Everybody needs to understand why those things are important in order to get the votes. But anyway.
There's a gentleman right there, and then we'll go to the gentleman over here.
Thank you.
Please
Dave
introduce
Rabinowitz.
yourself.
Dave Rabinowitz, yeah. When this country first became a country 230-something years ago, more than 90% well over 90% of the population was engaged in agricultural production. Since that time, per capita demand for agricultural products has not gone down. And yet a combination of technology and other innovations has led to the point where today we're producing more than enough product to meet demand with well under 5% of the population working. We're getting the same level of innovation and technological advances in manufacturing. And is there any reason to expect that in the future manufacturing will actually provide a significant employment base?
Mm-hmm. It's an interesting situation in that, you know, manufacturing by its very nature, competitive manufacturing demands increases in productivity for a nation and for a company, and that, you know, productivity increases when you get less people doing, you know, the same work or greater output. So one of the, you know, dirty little secrets is a more productive, you know, manufacturing economy has less people employed directly in manufacturing. But it's also true that that for advanced manufacturing, manufacturing in general, and particularly advanced manufacturing, the multiplier effect on the economy is fairly large, and it multiplies both in terms of other jobs, you know, support jobs and service jobs and other things. And there's also a multiplier of other businesses. So businesses actually grow, and so it's a more complicated equation than in agriculture. But even agriculture did the same thing, right? We were able to grow new businesses because everybody wasn't out on the farming. So you do head in that direction, but the secret is really to be able to, you know, drive those multipliers, particularly to new business growth, to, you know, to innovate the next generation of products.
Just to add, you know, a small example, it is true that all the trends point towards increasing automation, therefore a need for fewer people on the actual factory floor. However, I think newer thinking is sort of to expand our concept of the factory floor and to think about the jobs that are generated by the multiplier effect.
Right.
Well, a small example that might, you know, partially convince you is if you look at the information technology sector, manufacturing of information technology related products similarly has, you know, there's been a decline in the actual headcount, the raw headcount needed on the manufacturing floor. However, the total employment in the IT sector, the complete IT sector has grown, and that has purely come from services and related needs. So, you know, that is but one example, but I think that might show where the trends might move to allow countries that are at the advanced manufacturing level to have some sort of a competitive advantage.
I just wanted to add a couple comments before we go to the gentleman right here, that I think manufacturing is a critical part of the innovation chain. So if you have terrific ideas coming out of national laboratories or universities, the next step to create wealth and growth and so forth in your economy does often require a manufacturing base. And second, it's very hard to pay your way in the world without manufacturing. We're very sophisticated in terms of services that independently have a role in our balance of trade. But if you look at the overwhelming contribution in paying our way in the world, it's still out of manufacturing, which of course bundles advanced services with it. And third, if you think of the agricultural industry as opposed to who's actually working on the farm, you have agricultural research, you have an extension service, you're educating the farmers, you're packaging the food. All this is itself a major industry. Let's turn to the gentleman there.
My name is Fred Stahl. I was a former director of manufacturing in the Boeing Company. I was also co-director of the Lean Aerospace Initiative up at MIT. And you didn't talk much about production labor management. I think that there's something missing there. You know, when I was at Boeing, those guys over there in headquarters, you know, they were always concerned with allocating the productivity of capital and productivity of overhead spending on R&D. And but I think the data shows that there's a bet missing in managing labor for greater productivity. And the information I have is that there are ways of doing that, and unfortunately, you can't get at them with national policy or federal spending that can make a big difference in the bottom line, which, as we know, is total customer value delivered for each dollar of input resource, including the overhead and the capital. And that, I think, is where the battle really is in national competitiveness, on the factory floor with that net value output. Are we missing something with production labor management?
It's an essential part. When you look at the skill sets that manufacturers say they're missing, so we've got a labor force shortage, right? Our research said that we've got over 600,000 jobs in this country right now that can't be filled in manufacturing. Labor that can't be filled because we don't have the right skill sets. When you look at those skill sets, it really gets at the sets of things that you're talking about. They're looking for workers that have problem-solving skills, that can be more fully engaged and empowered in making the organization better, to improving the innovation process. So yeah, we are missing things, and in many cases, we've got an organized labor culture that makes it difficult to get past some of those work rules. As we get to advanced manufacturing, in many cases, you actually replace the traditional notion of the labor, and you're dealing with a technician virtually, right? And in some cases, that's how you're getting around that. But yeah, there's a critical element in there that in the advanced manufacturing world, what maybe we're not making clear is that they are much more than producing something. They're an integral part of the things you're talking about, and they tend to go hand in hand to be successful with it. So yeah, we're not talking about it clearly enough, partially because there's some, it's politically charged in some respects, but you're absolutely right.
Let me just say, 5 words. I'm concerned about the organization and management of work.
Okay.
Amy, do you have any? No. There's a gentleman right in the back there seated.
Good morning. My name is Rockefeller Harris. I'm with the Agency for International Development. I would like to thank you for the presentation. All your points resonated with what we advocate as the major driver for economic development in the countries where we do work overseas. I wanted to point out maybe what you have as remnant slides that didn't get to appear today. Maybe 2 compelling elements that makes up this narrative, and hope that you could make some brief commentary. One is the element related to the service sector, which for a time it seemed as if more focus was for the U.S. to be an economy that's driven by service as opposed to manufacturing, and whether or not that this new impetus, at least from this administration, where the focus was for driving our own economic growth through infrastructure and manufacturing as being the main focus to revitalize our economy. And the next is as it relates to outsourcing. And I think the Boeing example is that you shared with us is a very compelling element, because what would otherwise be viewed as outsourcing by Boeing is really the innovation or the recognition that innovation can come from anywhere, and that we need to establish strategic alliances or strategic partnerships. And I guess in full disclosure, I do public-private partnerships at the ID, where we align our resources with other countries and other resource partners to accomplish development outcomes.
Well, on your first point, first of all, I'm not an economist, and I'm biased. So I believe manufacturing. I showed you I've been doing this for my entire career, which is going on 30 years now with this firm and helping clients. So I've got a perspective, both from the shop floor and working with organizations around the world, that manufacturing is and should be an essential driver to economic development. I think services are critical, but I think we've seen that, and I'm not having the economic analysis handy to show you, but I think services don't multiply the same way. Innovations are different. They don't drive the innovation ecosystem that is so essential to growing prosperity. So, and as a result, I think that, whatever is, return some attention to manufacturing, and particularly advanced manufacturing, as the kernel, as the core of what's necessary to grow the economy, is certainly, movement in the right direction from my biased view of after looking at this for 30 years. Other comments or?
Well, I would just go back to I'm sorry.
No, go ahead.
The gentleman's question about what about manufacturing employment, and of course, overwhelmingly, statistics would show that we are, quote unquote, a service economy. I would just add that sometimes that distinction is a bit artificial when you export a Dreamliner in the future, or you export a 787 or a GE turbine or a big Cat earth mover. Bundled with that are a group of sophisticated services, the research, the supply chain management, the design work, and so forth. So I think sometimes that division is artificial. And if you go to an extreme and you have a retail operation that can add a lot to productivity, looking back over the past 20 years, that Walmart's use of information technology has driven a good deal of productivity growth. But in terms of really transforming an economy, you can't really think that the work that goes into having a successful food chain, let's say, says the same thing about an economy as being able to manufacture a microprocessor or a 3D manufacturing or additive manufacturing plant.
Kent, I'd like to add one more point. You mentioned the word statistics. So actually the questions that were just asked, I think they're complex, but they're made more complex by the fact that we don't have accurate statistics, trade statistics and others, to measure the full impact of the outsourcing of both goods and services, yet the correct attribution of value added to the different economies that participate in sort of this huge fan out.
Right.
So that makes these questions even harder to pinpoint accurately.
Yeah, part of, one thing that is clear, that the notion of outsourcing for the sake of outsourcing, as we said, for low-cost labor is kind of faded. There are still industry sectors, types of industries where that's essential because the only driver of differentiation is cost, but generally that's not the driver. When you look at the Boeing situation, other things, one of the reasons that the World Economic Forum has engaged us to do this manufacturing for growth effort is because CEOs are very frustrated with trying to communicate to policymakers, how complex their supply chains are and why they're complex, that it's not a black or white, it's got to be made here or it's got to be made there. The notion that you can have job growth here and there, and that those other locations done correctly help create competitive advantage. And in Boeing's case, it allows them to Fred can probably talk about it better, allows them to compete with a very, fierce competitor in Airbus and what EADS does. And to some extent, you've got the state-owned enterprise, virtual equation operating through there. But in the absence of that, and it's very, very hard to measure in the economic statistics, it's if I didn't do this, would I be competitive? And if I wasn't competitive, would I be able to put those planes in the sky or whatever the product is? So it is a complicated equation, but we generally find it's a very thoughtful equation now. Might have been different, 15, 20 years ago, but in terms of where, what partners you choose and why those supply chain partners are picked, and the location turns out to be the location, as opposed to some, other overt attempt to offshore.
The gentleman here in the tan suit.
Hi, Ed Hamler, the Roosh Pack and Executive Intelligence Review. I had a broader question, which pertains to, I guess, the place of manufacturing in the entire economy. Obviously, we have things that are going to immediately affect the manufacturing sector, which is obviously banking crises, and here and also Europe. There's a lack of skilled labor, as you raise, especially amongst youth and young adults. My question pretty much is, don't we need more of a discussion about where the direction of the entire country in which manufacturing is going to play a part? Franklin Roosevelt, used to get on the horn, used to get on TV and tell people, hey, here's where we're going, here's the vision of the nation. Kennedy, other great presidents did this kind of thing where you would mobilize key areas of the economy to, orchestrate development, creativity, and change. And I don't really see that much of a discussion occurring. I'm not saying this is going to come from the manufacturing sector per se, but I do feel as strongly about manufacturing as the panelists do, and I just do not see currently why we're not talking about things like the North American Water and Power Alliance, getting well beyond nuclear power to fusion power, these kinds of things, really transforming the entire nation and mobilizing manufacturing to do so.
We're going to make that the last question. I realize we got so interested in manufacturing that we're well past the witching hour here, but that's a complicated question. Craig?
I don't have a clear answer for you. I mean, yes, I think that more of a national mandate, an education process, an outreach process would be essential. I mean, I think it does need to start at the top. We need to see it as a national priority. As I said, oddly enough, the American public is closer to accepting that. We're just not hearing that message. We're not crystallizing that message and putting it out and linking the importance of it to our future and to our future prosperities. And I do believe that unless we do that, it's going to be very hard to attract the next generation, to create excitement that's necessary to be able to be successful. So I think a lot of this is about putting out the right messages consistently and getting the national following to understand it. So,
Any last word?
Very quick. I do believe this administration, has been trying to put efforts together to, I think there has been some hollowing out of vision and capacity in manufacturing over the last 10 to 20 years. This administration has, from where we sit, that, our feeling is that they're trying to put partnerships together, the whole university, industry and government partnerships, have hubs, energy hubs, manufacturing, I guess new manufacturing institutes and hubs that are being planned that will come up over the next 2 to 5 years. So I think that, at least from the point of view of the federal government and the administration, there have been, activities started up over the last 2 to 3 years, and that hopefully, generate positive results and positive emotion going forward.
And this may be a lasting change. I noticed in the Republican primaries there was a considerable emphasis on manufacturing. I think it was Senator Santorum as an incentive wanted to have a zero capital gains rate for manufacturing firms. So there's maybe something stirring on, as we say, both sides of the aisle with regard to an interest in manufacturing.
in fact, tomorrow Deloitte's releasing something we call an election brief, and we do that this time of year in these years, and it's on manufacturing, the manufacturing opportunity, and we've had the opportunity to brief Vice President Biden last week, and other members were doing that with we've done it initially, and we'll do it again with the Romney camp. It's a bipartisan look at the manufacturing opportunity, and we're doing everything we can to try to, raise the awareness at both the public level and the policymaker level, because I think you're right, we've talked to ourselves for too long, and now, so that'll be out tomorrow, and hopefully we'll continue to try to make a dent in getting some, continue this positive movement that we see in the administration around manufacturing.
Well, let me thank you all for a terrific set of questions and just fabulous presentations, very thought-provoking.
Thank you.